So this week is all about corrective feedback. You have the classic cartoon here of I Tarzan, you Jane, to which Jane responds, no, I'm Tarzan, you're Jane. And it's an example of when do we make feedback that is corrective to students. Most of the slides this week, the first 10 to 12, are focused on speaking. We will touch on feedback on writing at the end. As we work with English language learners, we need to be very intentional about the feedback that we give them. When we think about corrective feedback, these 4 questions typically are asked. Should learner errors be corrected? If so, when should they be corrected? Which errors should be corrected, and how should they be corrected? As you might expect, the different theorists have different opinions on how feedback should or should not occur. The naturalists don't see a need for error correction because the focus is on competence. Behaviorists see an absolute need for error correction. The reality may be somewhere in the middle. The majority of teachers and researchers and students believe feedback is necessary, and it's choosing when to give that feedback. And by the end of the lecture today, I hope you have a better feel for that. Before we move on to some specific examples of errors students might make, I want to talk about, in general, some categories that students might have trouble with. First would be irregular verbs, especially the past tense. Speak, spoke, take, took. These verbs don't follow the regular ED form like plan, planned, play, played, test, tested. Students will typically overgeneralize the ED form until they learn the irregular form. And that's typical for English language learners as well. Prepositions are notorious for being difficult because we don't use the same preposition in every language. We typically have a word-to-word translation for prepositions, but we don't always use that same word in the same expression from language to language. Related to that are phrasal verbs like take off. I can take off my shoes. I can take off on Friday. The plane can take off. These expressions that are a verb plus a preposition have lots of multiple meanings, and ideally we would try to avoid those, but when we can't, we need to make the meaning explicit to students. These are just a few areas that are examples of categories students may have trouble with. So if we have this example sentence, the student might say, I visit my aunt yesterday. In some languages, this would be correct because yesterday shows that it is in past tense, and visit is an infinitive form that doesn't change. But that's not true in English. So we have to teach students that we have to make things past tense by changing the verb in English. The question is, how do we give that corrective feedback? We'll see that over the next few slides. So the explicit way to respond and give feedback would be to inform the speaker that they're incorrect. No, that's wrong. Not visit my aunt yesterday, visited. You're providing the correct form. You're making them aware of the error. This isn't terribly helpful for new language learners and for children. Typically, competence is more meaningful to them. and to communication that they have with others. Now, older learners who have learned more about grammar do appreciate explicit correction more. So it depends on the learner. So a clarification request is a very natural way to indicate there's a misunderstanding or that something wasn't quite right. Pardon? Sorry? Huh? This shows the English language learner that there's something that needs to be improved, and it helps them to think about rephrasing what they've just spoken. Again, this isn't great for young English language learners, but it may be effective for older English language learners. Repetition can be another natural way to provide feedback. The repetition back is with the incorrect form, usually with emphasis on the error, and the tone of voice may show that there's something. I visit my aunt yesterday. That indicates that something needs to be changed. Repetition can be effective for all ages of learners. Recasts are a form that's used very often for corrective feedback. You rephrase the utterance to eliminate errors, demonstrating the correct form. A very explicit example was, "Oh, you visited your aunt yesterday?" The implicit example would take the ownership onto you as teacher. I visited my aunt last week. We'll talk more about recasts in a few minutes. With metalinguistic feedback, the teacher poses questions or information, usually seeking a yes or no response without providing the correct form. You're trying to get the student to self-correct. So, for example, you might say, there's a mistake in tense, or is it visit yesterday? Or I don't think we visit yesterday. Elicitation is trying to lead the student to the correct form. So the teacher directly elicits the correct form from the student by asking questions or by pausing and asking the student to reformulate the question. So yesterday you visit, trying to get the student to fill in the ed, the correct past tense form, visited. Or try that again. How do we say that in the past tense? Yesterday we... Or you could say, do we visit yesterday or visited? Do we say visit yesterday or visited yesterday? This slide gives you an overview of each of the feedback forms that we've talked about. So the most effective types of feedback based on the research encourage cognition, and they are metalinguistic, elicitation, clarification, and repetition. The most common corrective feedback that is used is recast, but it's the least effective. It's also least effective for children. Think of recast in terms of spell check. If you misspell a word and the machine just corrects it for you, did you learn the correct spelling or did you just get it? You can also think of it in terms of GPS. If you just put the destination address in, are you thinking about how to get there, or are you just following the prompts from the GPS app? The same thing is true with recast for English language learners. They may not realize that the form you're giving them is the correct form, or they may not even understand what you're doing at all. In terms of feedback strategies, use a variety of feedback. Try different strategies with students and see which ones are most effective. Be consistent. Try not to interfere with their speech. Don't interrupt them when they are saying something in class Because remember, we want them to focus on learning the content as they also learn the language. Especially for younger learners, we want to limit the corrective feedback. The focus needs to be more on communication, competence, rather than on perfection. Give your students time to self-correct. If you've given a corrective feedback strategy, wait. Let them have time to think and process through what might need to be corrected. Use your voice, accent, intonation. We've seen that intonation is important in a lot of these strategies. It's very important in both speaking and in writing that we don't simply give students the answer, and that we also don't give lengthy explanations. Students will pick up on what they're ready for at that time, but we want them to have some productive struggle and not just give it away so they don't have to think. Who should be making the correction? This is one of the questions that we talked about at the beginning. Ideally, the goal is for the student to self-correct. That's the primary corrective agent. Students tend to correct each other. This needs to be monitored because they may not always know the correct form if it's a student with weak academic English skills or another English language learner. But students do often correct each other, and this can be effective if it's appropriate. The teacher correction is probably the least effective in making change in the student's language. So first, self-correction, second, peer correction, third, teacher correction. So responses to our other corrective feedback questions. Should learners' errors be corrected? Yes, otherwise errors may become fossilized. That means that the error becomes normal to the student and they don't see it as something that needs to be changed. When should learners' errors be corrected? When it doesn't interfere with conversation. Again, we want students to focus on learning and talking about course content. We also want to correct errors when we hear the same error repeated over and over. This may be a time to have a mini lesson on, for example, irregular verbs, because we know that that error is something a student is struggling with and they need some explicit instruction about it. Which error should be corrected? For beginners, we need to focus on meaning. Again, we're looking at competence, not perfection. Adults typically want to have the same control of English as they do of their first language. So we do talk about grammar and form more with older English language learners than we do with beginners. In terms of written feedback, English language learners in particular love written feedback of their work. They don't always catch the oral feedback we give them because they can't come back to it. But written feedback they do come back to. So a great tool for this is reply response journals, having students journal about course content and about personal things as well can be a great way to get them to write and for you to have an opportunity to give feedback. It's hard to believe that some of our younger learners who might be refugees or immigrants from countries of poverty, stickers are very important to them. They might not have had them before. For our older learners, use a key so that they can understand what your markings are. If you're putting a V and you mean verb, they might not know that. So make sure that they know what your abbreviations stand for so they can know what to work on. So one of your discussion posts or questions this week is about the types of corrective feedback you use or you think you might use in the classroom. Think about this question and give a thorough response. What's your natural inclination? Do you use one of the techniques we talked about? And how effective are those techniques in the context where you use them? Thank you.